I tamed an alien Siren in battle. Now she won't let me leave. I came to Eclipse Hollow for a quick fight and a faster payday. I didn't expect to end up face-to-face with a 7-foot alien goddess who rules a blood-soaked arena, and definitely not to kiss her in front of a roaring crowd after killing her champion. Now she says I claimed her, and if I don't survive her deadly trials, I don't leave alive. They call her the Siren of the Void, and I think I just became her favorite plaything. Love gritty, high-stakes sci-fi with badass alien queens and rogue human survivors? Then you're in the right place. Subscribe now for more epic HFY-style stories full of action, heat, and twisted intergalactic romance. The Eclipse Hollow space station drifted on the edge of the galaxy like some forgotten carcass of steel and rust, its flickering lights barely cutting through the void. The air inside was thick, a choking mix of scorched metal, stale sweat, and something else, something sweet and heady that clung to the lungs like a promise. This wasn't a place for the faint-hearted. It was a lawless pit, a sprawling junk heap turned underground arena where smugglers, renegades, and alien warriors came to bet, brawl, and burn off whatever demons they carried. The hum of dying reactors pulsed through the walls, a heartbeat of chaos in the dark. Jaxon Creed brought his battered ship in for a landing, the engines coughing out one last groan before shutting down. He was 35, tall and broad, his frame packed with lean muscle that strained against the tight black leather jacket he wore. His dark hair was a mess, dusted with grime from weeks on the run, and his gray eyes carried the sharp, cold edge of a man who'd seen too much and cared too little. A botched smuggling run had left him with a busted ship, a drained credit account, and half the damn coalition on his tail. Eclipse Hollow was his last shot. Money to fix the rig, maybe a stiff drink, and if he was lucky, a night of trouble to drown out the rest. He stepped out onto the dock, boots clanging against the metal floor, his empty plasma pistol swinging uselessly at his hip. The arena sat at the station's core, a brutal sprawl of rusted steel bleachers circling a cage that gleamed under flickering red lights. The crowd was a riot of noise, hundreds of voices shouting bets, fists pounding the air, alien growls mixing with the thumping bass of some glitchy electronic beat. Bloodstains and claw marks scarred the cage floor, a testament to the fights that had come before. Jaxon felt his pulse kick up a notch as he pushed through the throng. This was his kind of place, raw, reckless, and reeking of danger. He wasn't here to sightsee. He needed cash, and fast. One fight, he muttered to the squat, yellow-eyed alien running the betting counter, its jagged teeth flashing in a smirk. Hand to hand. Put me in. The creature sized him up, its bulbous gaze lingering on the scars crisscrossing Jackson's knuckles. Fresh meat, huh? Fine. You're up against Krillix. Don't say I didn't warn you, human. Jaxon shrugged. He'd fought worse, or so he told himself. Names didn't mean much when you were dodging fists and claws. The cage door clanged shut behind him as he stepped inside, the crowd's roar swelling like a tidal wave. His opponent slithered out from the shadows, a hulking, octopus-like alien standing 8 feet tall, its slimy gray-green body glistening under the lights. 8 writhing tentacles lashed the air, each one thick as Jackson's arm and tipped with barbs that could shred steel. Krillix hissed, its beak snapping open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Jaxon tightened his grip on the short dagger he'd been handed, rolling his shoulders as the adrenaline hit. The buzzer screamed, and the fight was on. Krillix lunged, tentacles whipping toward him like living cables. Jaxon ducked low, feeling the rush of air as one barb missed his skull by inches. He rolled to the side, boots skidding on the slick floor, and drove his blade into the nearest tentacle. A wet screech tore from the creature's throat as blue blood sprayed across the cage, splattering Jackson's chest. The crowd went wild, their shouts rattling the steel. He didn't let up, darting in close. He slammed his fist into the alien's soft underbelly, then slashed again, severing another limb. Krillix thrashed, its remaining tentacles coiling around his legs, yanking him off balance. Pain shot through his calf as barbs dug in, but Jaxon twisted free, adrenaline drowning out the sting. With a guttural yell, he leapt onto the creature's back, driving the dagger deep into its neck. The alien shuddered, collapsing in a twitching heap, its blood pooling beneath him. Jaxon stood, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. His jacket was torn, his arms streaked with blue and red, his own blood mixing with the alien's. The crowd's cheers pounded in his ears as he wiped the blade on his thigh, catching his breath. He'd won. Easy money. Or so he thought. Then he felt it, a prickling heat crawling up his spine like someone was watching him too damn close. He looked up, and there she was. She sat high above the cage on a jagged throne of scrap metal, legs crossed in a way that drew every eye in the room. Veyra Kalthar, they called her, the Siren of the Void, queen of this hellhole. Her skin was a deep, rich purple, smooth and flawless, shimmering faintly under the red lights like some rare gem pulled from the dark. She was tall, easily over 7 feet, her body a deadly curve of muscle and grace wrapped in a tight, black armored suit that left little to the imagination. Every swell and dip of her form on display. Long, jet black hair spilled down her back, framing a face that was all sharp angles and predatory beauty. But it was her eyes that hit him hardest, twin pools of glowing violet, burning with an intensity that made his gut twist and his blood surge south. She didn't move at first, just watched him, her lips curling into a faint, dangerous smirk. Then she stood, and the crowd fell silent, the air itself seeming to thicken with her presence. Her hips swayed as she descended the steps, each movement deliberate, hypnotic, her boots clicking against the metal. Jaxon couldn't look away, not from the way her suit hugged her thighs, not from the faint sway of her chest as she approached. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand tall despite the ache in his legs and the heat pooling low in his body. She stopped inches from him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her. Up close, her purple skin gleamed, smooth and taut over every curve, and that sweet, intoxicating scent hit him full force. Something wild and alien that made his head swim. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, and when she spoke, her voice was a low, husky purr that vibrated through his chest. "You broke my rules, human," she said, her tone laced with dark amusement. "Krillix was mine, my strongest. You took him down like he was nothing. That makes you a challenge." Jaxon opened his mouth to argue. Hell, he just wanted the credits and a way out. But before he could get a word in, she stepped closer, her chest brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through him, his breath catching as her scent flooded his senses. "Listen, lady," he managed, forcing a grin despite the way his pulse hammered. "I didn't mean to step on any toes. Just here for the payout." Her smirk widened, flashing sharp fangs that glinted in the dim light. "No toes," she murmured, leaning in until her lips hovered a heartbeat from his ear. "But you've claimed my attention. And in my arena, that means you've claimed me." His brain short-circuited, trying to process her words, but then she grabbed his jaw with clawed fingers, firm, not painful, and tilted his head up. Before he could react, her mouth crashed into his. The kiss wasn't soft. It was raw, demanding, her lips hot and insistent against his, her tongue slipping past to taste him with a boldness that made his knees buckle. She tasted like spice and something darker, something that burned through him like a shot of illegal liquor. His hands twitched at his sides, instinct screaming to grab her, to pull her closer, but the crowd's sudden roar snapped him back. She broke away, leaving him dazed, lips tingling, and a fire raging in his gut he couldn't ignore. Veyra stepped back, her violet eyes gleaming with triumph. "You're mine now, little human," she declared, loud enough for the arena to hear. The crowd erupted, fists pounding steel, voices howling in approval. Jaxon blinked, still reeling, his body buzzing from the kiss and the weight of her words. "Wait, what?" he croaked, but she was already turning, gesturing toward the cage's exit. "Prove yourself," she called over her shoulder, her hips swaying as she walked away. "Or you don't leave this place alive." Jaxon ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as the reality sank in. He'd come for a quick fight, not whatever this was. His eyes tracked her retreating form. The deep purple skin, the curve of her back, the way she moved like she owned every damn inch of this station. She did, he realized. And now, somehow she owned him too. Oh, hell, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He'd fought aliens, dodged bounty hunters, survived crash landings, but this was a whole new kind of trouble. Trouble he wasn't sure he wanted to escape. The crowd surged around him, dragging him toward the next stage of whatever insane game he'd just stumbled into, and deep down, a reckless part of him grinned. Fine. If she wanted a challenge, he'd give her one she'd never forget. Jaxon Creed barely had time to catch his breath from the chaos of the cage fight before the crowd's roar shifted. Less chaotic now, more focused, like they were hungry for something bigger. His chest still heaved, sweat and alien blood streaking his torn jacket, the taste of Veyra's kiss lingering on his lips like a brand he couldn't shake. That damn purple-skinned Sirenoid had turned his night upside down in 10 seconds flat, and now here he was, stuck at her game whether he liked it or not. Prove himself or die, she'd said. He'd faced worse odds, but none with a 7-foot alien queen staring at him, like he was both prey and prize. She'd vanished into the throng after dropping that bombshell, leaving him surrounded by a pack of her lackeys, hulking figures in mismatched armor, their eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and menace. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute with scales like cracked stone, shoved him toward a side tunnel off the arena. Move, human, it growled, voice like gravel scraping steel. Jaxon stumbled, but caught himself, shooting the thing a glare. Easy, ugly. I'm walking. The brute snarled, but a sharp whistle from somewhere above cut it off. Veyra's people, he figured. She was watching even now. The tunnel was a tight squeeze, walls dripping with condensation and patched with rust, the air growing colder and damper the deeper they went. Dim lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. Jackson's boots echoed with each step, his mind racing. He'd signed up for a quick payout, not some alien death match, or whatever this was. That kiss, though, it had hit him harder than Krillix's tentacles, stirring something reckless in his gut he didn't want to name. He shook it off. Focus. Survive. Get the hell out. They emerged into a smaller chamber, a prep room carved out of the station's guts. Crates of gear were stacked against the walls, blades, chains, busted tech, and a single metal slab sat in the center, stained with dark smears he didn't want to think about. The brute shoved him toward it. Strip, it barked. Jaxon raised a brow, hands on his hips. You gonna buy me dinner first? The thing didn't laugh, just pointed a clawed finger at his chest. Armor up or die naked. Your call. Before he could argue, the door hissed open again as she walked in. Veyra Kalthar. The air shifted the second she entered, like the room itself bent to her presence. Her deep purple skin caught the faint light, smooth and taut over every curve. Her armored suit hugging her like a second skin, sleek, black, and cut just low enough to make his throat dry. Those violet eyes locked onto him, sharp and unreadable, and that damn smirk played on her lips again, fangs peeking out. She carried herself like she owned the place. Hell, she did, and every step toward him felt like a predator closing in. You're still breathing, she said, her voice low and rich, sliding over him like a physical touch. Good. I'd hate to waste a pretty face before the real fun starts. Jaxon snorted, leaning back against the slab, arms crossed. Yeah? What's your idea of fun, sweetheart? 'Cause I'm guessing it's not drinks and a dance. Her smirk widened, and she stepped closer, too close, her chest inches from his, that wild, sweet scent of hers hitting him like a punch. Oh, you'll dance, human, she murmured, tilting her head so her hair brushed his shoulder. But first you bleed. She gestured to the slab, and one of her goons tossed a bundle at him, a patchwork of leather and metal, some kind of crude armor. Jaxon caught it, eyeing her warily. What's this trial of yours? Another cage fight? Veyra chuckled, a sound that rumbled deep in her throat and sent a shiver down his spine. Not quite. The mark of blood. You faced the craven stalker, alone. Bring me its head, and I'll carve my claim into you myself." Her clawed hand trailed down her own chest as she spoke, lingering just above her heart, her eyes never leaving his. "Fail, and, well, you won't need to worry about that." Jaxon swallowed, his pulse kicking up despite himself. "Sounds like a party. What's in it for me?" She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, breath hot against his skin. "Survive, and you get to touch me, little human. Win my trials, and I might let you keep me." His blood surged, heat pooling low, but he forced a grin, stepping back to break the spell. "Deal, but I'm not little where it counts." Her laugh was sharp, delighted, and she turned away, hips swaying as she left him to gear up. "Prove it," she called over her shoulder, and then she was gone. He stripped down to his undershirt and pants, the cold air biting his skin as he strapped on the armor. Tight leather pads over his chest and thighs, metal plates on his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it'd have to do. The goons handed him a dagger, longer than the last one, wickedly sharp, and shoved him toward a hatch in the wall. It slid open with a groan, revealing a glass-walled arena suspended high above the main floor, the crowd below already baying for blood. Jaxon exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Time to dance." The hatch slammed shut behind him as he stepped into the glass cage, the floor slick with condensation and old stains. The walls were transparent, giving the crowd a front-row seat to whatever was about to happen. He tightened his grip on the dagger, scanning the shadows. The air was heavy, thick with a musky, animal stench that made his hair stand on end. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the glass, followed by the scrape of claws on metal. The craven stalker burst from a hatch on the far side, and Jaxon's gut clenched. It was massive, 10 feet of rippling muscle and black scales, its body hunched like a predator built for slaughter. Its head was a nightmare of jagged horns and glowing orange eyes, jaws wide enough to snap him in half, lined with teeth like butcher knives. Claws the size of his forearm flexed as it prowled forward, tail whipping behind it like a barbed lash. The crowd roared, fists pounding the bleachers, but Jaxon barely heard them. His world narrowed to the beast and the blade in his hand. It charged without warning, claws raking the floor as it closed the distance in a heartbeat. Jaxon dove to the side, glass shuddering under his weight as he hit the deck. The stalker's tail slashed past, missing his throat by inches, and he rolled back to his feet, dagger raised. "Come on, you ugly bastard," he muttered, circling as it turned, snarling. He needed an opening, something to slow it down. The beast lunged again, jaws snapping, and Jaxon ducked low, slashing upward as he slid beneath it. The blade bit into its underbelly, drawing a spray of dark blood that splattered his face and chest. The stalker roared, rearing back, and Jaxon scrambled upright, dodging a claw swipe that cracked the glass wall behind him. The crowd went wild, their cheers a dull roar in his ears as he danced around the beast, looking for a weak spot. Its scales were like armor, but that soft underbelly, he could work with that. He feinted left, then darted right as the stalker swung again, its claws screeching against the floor. This time he got in close, driving the dagger into its side, twisting the blade as blood gushed over his hands. The beast thrashed, tail whipping around to slam into his chest. Pain exploded through his ribs, knocking him back against the glass, breath whooshing out of him. He hit the ground hard, rolling just as a claw slammed down where his head had been. "Too close," he grunted, forcing himself up, chest aching but adrenaline keeping him moving. The stalker was slowing now, blood pooling beneath it, but it wasn't done. It lunged one last time, jaws wide, and Jaxon saw a shot. He dropped low, letting it overshoot, then sprang onto its back, wrapping an arm around its thick neck. The beast bucked, claws scrabbling, but he held on, driving the dagger deep into the base of its skull. A wet, crunching sound filled the air as the blade sank home, and the stalker let out a final, shuddering growl before collapsing, its massive bulk slamming into the glass floor. Jaxon slid off, panting, blood dripping from his hands and soaking his armor. The crowd's roar was deafening now, shaking the arena, but he barely noticed. He'd done it. He'd survived. He staggered to his feet, wiping his face with a shaky hand, and turned toward the hatch, only to see her standing there. Veyra stepped into the cage, her purple skin gleaming under the red lights. Her eyes locked on him with a hunger that made his pulse spike. She moved like a hunter, slow and deliberate, her armored suit clinging to every curve as she closed the distance. Blood streaked the floor between them, but she didn't flinch, just kept coming until she was right in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat rolling off her. "You bleed well," she murmured, her voice a low growl that sent a shiver through him. She reached out, clawed fingers brushing his chest where his armor had torn, tracing a line through the mix of sweat and blood. His breath hitched, body tensing as her touch lingered, her nails grazing his skin just hard enough to sting. "Told you I'd dance," he rasped, forcing a grin despite the ache in his ribs and the fire her touch was stoking. Her lips curled, fangs flashing. "You're not done yet." She pulled a thin, glowing rod from her belt, some kind of branding tool, its tip pulsing with heat, and held it up, her eyes never leaving his. "The mark of blood," she said, stepping closer until her chest pressed against his, her scent overwhelming him. "You've earned it, human. Now hold still." Jackson's heart pounded, but he didn't back down, not from the beast, and sure as hell not from her. Whatever she had planned, he'd take it, and maybe, just maybe, he'd turn this game around on her yet. Jaxon stood there, chest heaving, blood and sweat slicking his skin as Veyra loomed over him, the glowing rod in her hand pulsing like a living thing. Her violet eyes bored into his, fierce and unyielding, but there was something else there too, something hot, something that made his gut tighten and his breath catch. The crowd beyond the glass walls was a distant roar, their cheers fading into a low hum as the air between him and the Sirenoid thickened with unspoken stakes. He'd killed her beast. Now she was here to claim her prize, or maybe he was the prize. Either way, he wasn't backing down. "Hold still," she repeated, her voice a husky command that rumbled through him. She stepped in closer, her armored chest pressing firm against his torn leather, the heat of her body seeping through the gaps. His ribs ached from the stalker's blow, but that pain dulled under the electric jolt of her nearness. Her free hand slid up his arm, claws grazing his bicep, leaving faint red trails that stung in the best way. "This'll hurt," she murmured, lips curling into that fanged smirk, "but you'll like it." Jaxon clenched his jaw, meeting her gaze with a defiance he barely felt. "Do it," he growled, voice rough from exhaustion and something else he wouldn't name. Her smirk widened, and she pressed the rod against his chest, right over his heart. The heat hit first, a searing flash that made his muscles lock, a hiss escaping his teeth as the tip burned into his skin. Pain lanced through him, sharp and white-hot, but then her claws tightened on his arm, anchoring him, and the sting twisted into something darker, something that made his blood pound and his head swim. The rod pulsed, etching a spiraling mark into his flesh, a glowing violet brand that matched her eyes, shimmering faintly against his scarred skin. He grunted, biting back a louder sound as the heat sank deeper, but her touch kept him steady, her fingers digging in just enough to blur the line between pain and a rush he couldn't deny. She leaned in, her breath brushing his neck, lips hovering so close he could feel their warmth. "Mine now," she purred, the words sinking into him like the mark itself. And damn if his body didn't agree, heat flaring low despite the ache. She pulled the rod away, leaving the brand smoldering on his chest, and stepped back, her eyes raking over him like she was sizing up her work. Jaxon exhaled hard, sweat beading on his brow, the fresh mark throbbing in time with his pulse. "That all you got?" he rasped, forcing a grin through the haze. Veyra laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down his spine, and tossed the rod aside. "Oh, human," she said, her tail flicking lazily behind her. "We're just getting started." The crowd's roar surged back as she turned, leaving him marked and reeling, her purple form a promise of more to come. Jaxon watched her go, chest burning, and knew he was in deeper than he'd ever planned. Jaxon Creed leaned against the rusted wall of the prep room, the violet brand on his chest still smoldering from Veyra's touch, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the cramped space. The roar of the crowd from Trial 1 lingered in his ears, but here, in this damp, flickering hole, it was just him and the ache of his battered body. Ribs bruised, hands crusted with dried blood, and a stubborn heat in his gut that wouldn't quit, courtesy of that damn Sirenoid queen. She'd marked him, claimed him, and walked off like it was nothing, leaving him to stew in the aftermath. He wiped sweat from his brow, muttering a curse. One down. Whatever came next, he'd face it, preferably without losing any more pieces of himself. The door hissed open, cutting through the quiet, and Veyra stepped in, her deep purple skin catching the dim light like velvet stretched over steel. Her armored suit hugged every curve, tight across her chest, dipping low at the hips, and her violet eyes pinned him where he stood, sharp and unyielding. That smirk was back, curling her lips just enough to flash those fangs, and the air shifted, thickening with her presence. She didn't speak at first, just crossed the room with that slow, deliberate stride that made his pulse kick up despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "You're still standing," she said finally, her voice a low growl that slid over him like a rough hand. "Most don't make it past the first dance." Jaxon pushed off the wall, wincing as his ribs protested, and forced a grin. "Takes more than a lizard and a branding iron to put me down, sweetheart." Her smirk widened, and she stopped inches from him, her scent hitting him full force, wild sweet, like a drug he couldn't shake. "Good," she purred, reaching up to unfasten the shoulder plates of her armor. The metal clattered to the floor, revealing more of that flawless purple skin, smooth and taut over the curve of her shoulders, dipping down to frame the swell of her chest. She grabbed his wrist, yanking him forward until her chest pressed hard against his through the torn fabric of his shirt. The contact was a jolt, her body firm and warm, and Jackson's breath caught as blood rushed to his head, his skin prickling under her grip. "Run," she whispered, her lips brushing his neck, breath hot and teasing, carrying that intoxicating scent that made his body hum. "But don't think you'll escape me." Her tail flicked up, grazing his thigh, and he tensed, every nerve firing as she laughed. A dangerous sound that stoked the heat already burning in him. He gritted his teeth, pulling his wrist free and stepping back. "I don't run from anything," he rasped, voice rough with defiance and something else. "But I'll play." Her eyes gleamed, violet flames dancing in them. "You'll do more than play," she said, turning away, her hips swaying as she headed for the door. "This time I hunt." The goons materialized behind her, hauling Jaxon out of the room and through a twisting maze of tunnels, the station's rusted guts closing in around them. They shoved him into a wide, shadowed chamber, an abandoned labyrinth of narrow corridors, steel walls pitted with rust, and faint, flickering emergency lights casting weak red pools across the floor. The crowd loomed above on rickety platforms, their shouts rising like a storm as they spotted him, a sea of eager faces hungry for the next show. Veyra took her place on a high ledge, her purple form stark against the dim glow, silencing the mob with a raised hand. "Trial 2, she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "The chase in the dark. You run, human. My sisters and I hunt. Survive 30 minutes, and you claim your reward." She paused, her gaze locking onto his, a wicked glint in her eyes that made his gut twist. "Fail, and your hour's forever." 3 more Sirenoids stepped up beside her, tall, lean, their purple skin shimmering faintly, eyes glowing like hers. They moved with the same lethal grace, and Jackson's stomach sank. 4 against 1, in a pitch-black maze he didn't know. Perfect odds for a guy who'd just taken a beating. A hatch creaked open at the chamber's edge, revealing the dark maw of the labyrinth beyond. Veyra's voice rang out one last time. "Run fast, little human," she taunted, her tail flicking lazily. "I like my prey lively." The lights snapped off, plunging everything into blackness, and Jaxon bolted, boots slamming the metal as he dove into the maze. The dark swallowed him whole, the air thick with damp rot and the hum of dying tech. His eyes strained against the void, catching only glints of rusted pipes and dangling cables, traps waiting to snag him. Behind him, the Sirenoids moved, soft, swift footsteps echoing like ghosts, closing in fast. He turned a corner, nearly tripping over a pile of debris, and pressed himself against the wall, breath ragged. His heart pounded, adrenaline drowning the ache in his ribs as he yanked the dagger from his belt, slicing a loose wire overhead. Sparks flared, a brief flash scattering into the dark, and he tossed a chunk of scrap metal the other way as a decoy. It clattered loudly, drawing a hiss, one of them taking the bait. He grinned, pushing off again, weaving through the tight corridors with no plan, but to keep moving. The maze twisted around him, a snarled mess of steel and shadows, and every sound, every scrape, every whisper, sent his pulse racing. A shadow lunged from the left, one of her sisters, and he ducked, slashing blindly with the dagger. The blade hit something soft, a snarl echoing as she recoiled, and he darted past, squeezing through a narrow gap that scraped his armor raw. His lungs burned, legs screaming, but he kept going, the dart pressing him like a living thing trying to drag him down. Then he felt her, Veyra, a sudden shift in the air behind him, a brush of heat against his back. Her arms snaked around his waist, claws raking lightly over his stomach through the shredded fabric, igniting a jolt that made his knees buckle. "You're hot when you're scared," she whispered, her lips grazing his ear, her voice a velvet blade cutting through the void. His body shuddered, heat flaring where her claws pressed, but he twisted free, shoving her back and bolting forward. "Not scared yet," he growled, though his trembling hand said otherwise. Her laugh chased him, low and rich, wrapping around him like a net as he ran harder, the maze narrowing into a choke point. He squeezed through, armor scraping the walls, and stumbled into a wider stretch, the faint hum of machinery buzzing in the distance. Footsteps closed in, one of her sisters, eyes glowing like twin flames, and he dropped low, slashing at her legs as she lunged. She hissed, stumbling back, and he pushed past, heart hammering. Time blurred, minutes stretching into eternity, until another Sirenoid caught him, claws hooking his ankle, yanking him down hard. He hit the floor, breath exploding out, and she pounced, pinning him with her weight, all muscle and menace. Her glowing eyes bored into his, inches away, but he roared, twisting under her, and drove the dagger into her shoulder. She screeched, rolling off, and Jaxon scrambled up, staggering forward as the 30-minute mark loomed. The maze opened ahead, a faint glow marking the exit, and he poured everything into one last sprint, legs burning, chest heaving. Veyra was there again, her presence a storm at his heels, claws grazing his back in a teasing scrape that sent fire through him. "Almost mine," she purred, her voice so close he could feel her breath on his neck, but the lights snapped on just as he stumbled out, blinding him. He'd made it by a hair. Jaxon collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, sweat soaking his torn clothes, muscles taut and trembling under the strain. The crowd erupted, their cheers shaking the station, a deafening wave that drowned out his ragged gasps. He looked up, blinking through the glare, and there she was, Veyra, stepping out of the maze with that smirk, her purple skin gleaming under the harsh lights, her gaze burning into him like a brand all its own. She stalked toward him, slow and deliberate, the other Sirenoids fading back as she claimed the moment. The crowd's noise faded to a dull roar as she stopped inches from him, her scent washing over him again, wild and intoxicating. "You win," she said, her voice low and thick with something that made his blood hum, a promise wrapped in a threat. She reached out, her hand sliding up his chest, claws tracing the sweat-slicked lines of his muscles, lingering over the glowing brand she'd burned into him. The touch was light but deliberate, sending a shiver through him that he couldn't hide, his body still wired from the chase. "But I'm not done with you," she murmured, leaning in until her breath brushed his lips, hot and teasing. She took his hand, guiding it to her hip. Her skin cool under his fingers, smooth and firm, but burning where he touched, a heat that shot straight through him like a live wire. His grip tightened, instinct screaming to pull her closer, to feel more of that impossible warmth, but she held his gaze, violet eyes daring him to try. Jackson's throat went dry, his pulse pounding in his ears, every muscle coiled with exhaustion and a want he couldn't shake. "What's the reward, then?" he rasped, voice rough from the run and the tension crackling between them. Her smirk deepened, fangs glinting as she pressed closer, her chest grazing his just enough to make his breath hitch. "This," she whispered, letting his hand linger on her hip a moment longer, her tail flicking up to brush his leg. A slow, deliberate tease that left him reeling. Then she stepped back, breaking the contact, leaving him aching and off balance. "Two down," she purred, turning away, her purple form a vision of power and promise as she strode off, her tail swaying like a taunt. "One to go." The crowd surged around him, their cheers swallowing her words, but Jaxon stayed rooted, chest still heaving, the feel of her skin seared into his palm. He'd survived her hunt, claimed his touch, but damn if she didn't still hold him in her grip, pulling him deeper into her game with every step. Jaxon Creed slumped against the cold steel wall, chest still heaving from the chase, sweat dripping from his brow and soaking the tattered remains of his shirt. The violet brand on his chest pulsed faintly, a lingering echo of Veyra's touch, and his hand still burned where it had gripped her hip, cool, smooth, and impossibly alive under his fingers. The crowd's cheers from the maze exit roared in the distance, a dull thunder that couldn't drown out the pounding of his own pulse. 2 trials down, and he was still breathing barely. But damn if that purple-skinned Sirenoid didn't have him twisted up, her game sinking deeper into him with every step. He wiped his face, muttering a curse. One more. He could do this. The goons didn't give him long to rest. They materialized from the shadows, their scaled hands clamping onto his arms, dragging him away from the wall before he could catch his breath fully. "Move it, human," one growled, its voice like rocks grinding together. Jaxon stumbled but straightened, shooting the brute a glare. Yeah, keep your claws to yourself," he rasped, voice rough from exhaustion and the fire still smoldering in his gut. They hauled him through another twist of tunnels, the station's rusted guts closing in, damp, dark, and reeking of oil and decay. His legs ached, his ribs throbbed, but he kept his head up. Whatever Veyra had planned next, he'd face it head on. They shoved him into a new chamber, and the door sealed shut behind him with a hiss, cutting off the crowd's noise like a blade. The room was round, its walls lined with reflective glass that threw his own battered image back at him. Sweat-streaked, blood-smeared, eyes sharp with defiance despite the weariness. A single metal chair sat dead center, cold and unyielding, its surface scratched and dented from who knows what. The air was still, heavy, humming with a faint energy that prickled his skin. He flexed his hands, the dagger still tucked at his belt a small comfort, though he doubted it'd help here. This didn't feel like a fight, not the kind he knew, anyway. Then she entered. Veyra Kalthar stepped through a hidden panel, her deep purple skin catching the dim light in a way that made her look carved from shadow itself. Her armored suit clung to her like always, tight across her chest, hugging the curve of her hips. But her presence filled the room more than her body ever could, a storm of power and intent. Those violet eyes locked onto him, piercing and unblinking, and her lips curled into that familiar smirk, fangs glinting faintly. She moved with purpose, each step a quiet thud against the steel floor, until she stopped in front of the chair and sat, crossing her long legs with a grace that made his throat tighten. 2 trials, she said, her voice a low, rich hum that vibrated through the room, sinking into his bones. "And you're still here, human." Impressive. Jaxon leaned against the wall, crossing his arms despite the ache in his ribs, and forced a grin. "Told you I don't break easy, sweetheart. What's this one?" Gonna sick your whole damn family on me now." Her smirk widened, and she tilted her head, hair spilling over one shoulder like a dark wave. "No," she murmured, uncrossing her legs and leaning forward, elbows resting on her knees. "This time it's just you and me." He raised a brow, adrenaline stirring despite the exhaustion. "Sounds cozy. What's the catch?" She didn't answer right away, just stood, closing the distance between them in 3 slow strides, her hips swaying with that predatory grace that made his pulse kick up. She stopped inches from him, close enough that her scent, wild, sweet, intoxicating, washed over him, and he had to fight the urge to step back. Or closer. "The catch," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is your mind." She reached out, clawed fingers brushing his forehead, nails grazing his scalp with a light scrape that sent a shiver down his spine. "I'll give you everything you crave, if you're bold enough to take it." Before he could snap a comeback, a jolt of energy surged from her touch, violet and electric, racing through him like a live current. His vision blurred, the room dissolving around him, and he staggered, catching himself against the wall as the world twisted. When it steadied, he wasn't in the chamber anymore. He stood on an empty arena floor, vast and silent, bathed in a soft purple glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air was warm, weightless, and a faint breeze stirred his hair. Impossible, unreal. He flexed his hands, the dagger gone, his armor stripped away, leaving him in just his undershirt and pants, the brand on his chest glowing brighter now, a beacon in the haze. Then she appeared. Veyra stepped out of the light, and Jaxon's breath caught hard. She was bare, no armor, no suit, just her deep purple skin, smooth and flawless, gleaming faintly as if lit from within. Her hair floated around her in the zero-gravity wind, a dark cascade framing her face, and those violet eyes burned into him, fierce and unguarded. She moved toward him, every step a slow, deliberate tease, her body a map of curves and strength that made his mouth go dry. "You want me, Jaxon," she said, her voice a sweet, sharp blade that sliced through the silence, wrapping around his will. "Don't fight it." He tried to speak, to throw out some quip, but the words died as she reached him, her hands sliding up his arms, claws tracing his biceps with a touch that felt too real, cool, firm, alive. She pressed against him, her chest brushing his, and heat flared where their bodies met, a rush that made his blood pound south. "This what you want?" he managed, voice rough, but she just smiled, fangs glinting, and pushed him down. He hit the floor, soft, unreal, and she followed, straddling him, her weight pinning him as her hands roamed his chest, claws scraping lightly over the brand. Her lips found his neck, a slow graze that sent fire through him, and he groaned despite himself, the sound raw and unbidden. "Give in," she whispered, her breath hot against his skin, her body pressing harder, curves molding to him in a way that blurred the line between dream and reality. Her scent enveloped him, her hands slid down his sides, and every touch, her cool skin, her firm grip, felt like it was pulling him under, drowning him in a tide he couldn't fight. His hands moved on their own, gripping her hips, feeling the smooth heat of her under his palms, and she leaned in, lips hovering over his, her breath mingling with his in a tease that made his body ache. The scene shifted, growing heavier, her weight sinking into him, her chest pressed tight against his, her thighs clamping his hips as she rocked slightly, a rhythm that drove his pulse wild. "You're mine," she murmured, her voice a siren's call, and he felt it, heat pooling low, his resolve fraying as her claws traced his jaw, her lips brushing his with a promise he wanted to claim. His body burned, every nerve screaming to let go, to take what she offered, but something snapped in him, sharp, stubborn, human. Freedom. Strength. He wasn't her toy. "No," he growled, teeth gritted, and shoved her off with a force that surprised even him. She stumbled back in the illusion, eyes widening, and Jaxon surged to his feet, chest heaving. "I'm not your damn plaything," he shouted, voice echoing in the void. The purple light shattered, the arena fracturing like glass, and the world slammed back. The mirrored room, the chair, the cold steel under his boots. He was on his knees, sweat pouring down his face, breath ragged and uneven, the brand on his chest pulsing wildly. Veyra stood over him, real again, her armored form intact, her violet eyes wide with something new, shock, maybe, or hunger. She stepped closer, crouching until her face was level with his, and reached out, her hand brushing his cheek, claws grazing his stubbled jaw with a gentleness that didn't match the fire in her gaze. "You refused me," she whispered, her voice thick with awe and something darker, something that made his skin prickle. "But your body," her fingers slid down, resting over his racing heart, and he felt the heat of her touch through the sweat-soaked fabric, his pulse hammering under her palm. He swallowed hard, throat dry, and forced a grin, shaky but real. "Told you," he rasped, voice raw from the strain. "I win." Her lips twitched, a flicker of that smirk returning, and she leaned in, her breath brushing his lips, just close enough to tease, not close enough to take. "You did," she murmured, her hand lingering a moment longer before she pulled back, standing tall again, her purple skin gleaming under the lights. "But you're still mine, human, whether you admit it or not." Jaxon stayed on his knees, watching her turn away, the sway of her hips a taunt he couldn't ignore. His body ached, exhausted, alive, and buzzing with a want he'd barely reined in. 3 trials. He'd beaten them all. But as Veyra's shadow vanished through the panel, he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jaxon Creed hauled himself to his feet, legs trembling from the strain of 3 trials, the mirrored room spinning faintly around him as the last echoes of Veyra's illusion faded. Sweat plastered his torn shirt to his chest, the violet brand pulsing under the fabric like a live ember, and his breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He'd done it, beaten her beast, outrun her hunt, and broken her damn mind game. 3 trials, 3 wins, and he was still standing, staring down the Sirenoid queen who'd drag him into this mess. Veyra Kalthar lingered in front of him, her deep purple skin gleaming under the harsh lights, her violet eyes locked on his with a mix of shock and something hotter, something that made his gut tighten despite the exhaustion. "You refused me," she'd said, her voice still ringing in his ears, thick with that dark awe that sent a shiver through him. Her claws had brushed his cheek, her touch lingering like a promise, and he'd grinned, shaky, defiant, victorious. "I win," he'd rasped, and she'd pulled back, leaving him to catch his breath and wonder what came next. The door hissed open, and the goons were on him again, dragging him out of the chamber before he could ask. Their scaled hands clamped his arms, hauling him through the station's rusted tunnels. But this time he didn't fight it, just let them pull him along, head high, chest burning with more than just the brand. They dumped him back in the main arena, the heart of Eclipse Hollow, where the crowd waited, a seething mass of aliens and outlaws packed into the rickety bleachers, their roars shaking the steel. The air was thick with smoke and sweat, the red lights flickering overhead like dying stars, and Jaxon stood in the center of the cage, alone for a moment, the weight of his survival sinking in. 3 trials. He'd come here for credits, a quick fix for his busted ship. And now he was something else, something this mob was screaming for, their fists pounding the air like he was their damn champion. Then she appeared. Veyra stepped into the cage, her presence silencing the crowd with a single stride, her purple form cutting through the haze like a blade. Her armored suit hugged her curves, tight across her chest, dipping low at the hips, and her tail flicked lazily behind her, a predator's tease. Those violet eyes found his, sharp and unyielding, but there was a flicker in them now, something he hadn't seen before, something that looked like respect. Or hunger. Maybe both. She stopped a few feet away, hands on her hips, smirking that fanged smirk that had haunted him since the start. 3 trials, she announced, her voice ringing out over the arena, clear and commanding. The human has faced the mark of blood, the chase in the dark, and the temptation of the mind, and he stands unbroken. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of noise that rattled the cage, But Jaxon didn't flinch, just watched her, chest heaving, adrenaline still pumping through him. She stepped closer, her smirk softening into something dangerous, something that made his blood hum. "You've proven yourself," she said, quieter now, just for him. "No one's done that before." He grinned, wiping sweat from his brow with a shaky hand. "Told you I don't break easy," he rasped, voice rough from the trials and the tension crackling between them. "So what now? You gonna let me walk? Or is this where you pull some new trick?" Her eyes gleamed, and she closed the gap, stopping inches from him, her scent, wild, sweet, intoxicating, washing over him like a wave. "You've earned your freedom," she murmured, her claws brushing his chest, lingering over the brand. "But I don't think you want it." The crowd's roar faded to a dull hum as her words sank in, her touch sending a jolt through him that he couldn't ignore. She was right. Damn her, she was right. He'd come here to survive, to get out, but now, standing in her cage, marked by her hand, he felt something else, something reckless, something that wanted more than just a ticket off this wreck. He stepped forward, closing the last inch between them, his chest brushing hers through the torn fabric, heat flaring where they touched. "Maybe I don't," he said, voice low, rough with intent. "But if I stay, it's not just your game anymore." Her smirk faltered, eyes widening for a split second, and then he moved, fast, decisive, his hand snaking around her waist, pulling her hard against him. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath, but Jaxon didn't care. He tilted her chin up with his other hand, locking eyes with her, and crashed his lips into hers, a kiss that wasn't soft, wasn't gentle, but raw and claiming, matching every ounce of fire she'd thrown at him. Her claws dug into his shoulders, a sharp sting that made him growl into her mouth, and she kissed back, fierce and unyielding, her tongue brushing his with a heat that burned through him. The arena exploded. Shouts, cheers, fists pounding steel. But it was background noise as he pulled back, breathing hard, her taste lingering on his lips like spice and danger. "You're mine too," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, his grip tightening on her waist. "Call it even." Her laugh was low, throaty, and she pressed closer, her chest flush against his, her claws tracing his jaw. "Bold, human," she purred, her voice a taunt and a promise. "I like that." She broke away, turning to the crowd with a raised hand, silencing them again. "He's claimed his prize," she declared, her gaze flicking back to him, wicked and knowing. "And I've claimed mine." The mob roared its approval, but Veyra didn't linger. She grabbed his wrist, pulling him out of the cage and through a side hatch, away from the chaos, her tail brushing his leg as they went. Jaxon followed, pulse pounding, the heat of her grip sinking into him like a brand of its own. They ended up in her quarters, a shadowed chamber deep in the station, walls draped with furs and glinting tech, a wide bed of dark leather dominating the space. The door sealed behind them, cutting off the world, and she turned to him, shedding her armor with quick, practiced movements. It hit the floor in a clatter, leaving her in a thin undersuit that clung to her purple skin, every curve outlined in the dim purple light. Jackson's throat went dry, but he didn't hesitate, stripping off his own torn shirt, the brand glowing bright against his scarred chest, and closing the distance. She met him halfway, hands sliding up his arms, claws grazing his skin as she pulled him down onto the bed. He landed on his back, her weight settling over him, firm and warm, her thighs bracketing his hips. "You fought well," she murmured, leaning in, her lips brushing his jaw, her breath hot against his neck. "Now fight for this." Her claws raked down his chest, a slow scrape that made him hiss, heat flaring where she touched, and he gripped her hips, pulling her closer, feeling the smooth strength of her under his hands. Their mouths crashed together again, a tangle of heat and need, her fangs nipping his lip as his hands roamed her back, tracing the ridges of her spine. She pressed down, her chest against his, her tail coiling around his leg, a tease that drove his pulse wild. Every move was a dance, a push and pull of power and want, her skin cool against his heat, her scent drowning him in that wild sweetness. He rolled them, pinning her beneath him, and she laughed, that low, dangerous sound, claws digging into his shoulders as he kissed down her neck, tasting the salt and spice of her. The room faded, time blurring into a haze of touch and tension. Their bodies locked in a rhythm that matched the trials, fierce, unrelenting, alive. When they finally stilled, breathless and tangled in the furs, Jaxon lay on his back, her head resting on his chest, her claws tracing lazy circles over the brand. "You're staying," she murmured, not a question, her voice thick with satisfaction. He grinned, staring at the ceiling, the ache in his body a dull hum beneath the fire still smoldering in him. "Yeah," he said, hands sliding down her back, feeling the heat of her skin. "Ship's busted anyway." She lifted her head, violet eyes gleaming with that wicked glint. "Good," she purred, shifting to straddle him again, her tail brushing his thigh. "Because I'm not done with you, human." Her lips hovered over his, a tease and a threat, and Jaxon laughed, low and rough, pulling her down. "Bring it on," he muttered, and the room faded into shadow, the promise of more hanging between them, untamed, open, and electric.